Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our SOAN series videos. My name is Carrie Mahelko from the Steel Valley Authority, and I'll be moderating for today's webinar on helping you keep your DoD contracts. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on our website. If you have any questions of the presenters, please feel free to use the chat function, and I'll field those questions to the presenters towards the end of the program, along with some questions that some of you provided with your registrations. Additionally, if you're having any technical difficulties, just feel free to shoot me a message. A quick overview of the SVA and our SOAN program. We are a statewide organization that provides resources to small and medium-sized manufacturers who are experiencing difficulties ranging from loss of contracts to financial distress. The best part of our program is that these services are paid for by the Pennsylvania Department of Labor and Industry, so there is no cost to the company for our services. We have done numerous other webinars and videos to cover a range of topics, which are all available on our website, and I'll share in the chat box with everyone. Next, I'd like to turn it over to our speakers from Black Bottle IT, John Hensberger and Mark Malloy. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie. This is John Hensberger. Just wanted to introduce Black Bottle IT. So what we are is we're a cyber security company who specializes in protecting the manufacturers from the current cyber threat landscape. Mark Malloy, who we'll also be talking, is our compliance manager, and he'll be doing most of the meaty part of this presentation. So I'll just kind of go through why should a manufacturer care about NIST? One of our clients was a small manufacturer, 200 employees, traditional in that they're using a third-party IT provider to provide all of their IT services, including security. And they were breached, so the result of that breach was $250,000 worth of expenses related to responding to that breach, and then beyond the financial impact of the breach is that the time that it took for that organization to respond to it, to figure out what the scope of it was, and so that really took away from the core of their business, which wasn't responding to the breach, right? So it was a really long and lengthy process. It took that particular client 3 months to respond to that breach. So the moral of the story is that not all of the cyber attackers are after the large companies. They're after small companies, medium-sized companies, because traditionally those companies don't have the cybersecurity posture that maybe a large company would have, and so they're easier targets. And so there's a lot of smaller companies, but they're easier targets, and so the attackers are hitting them. And so that last line on the slide is 61% of all breach victims are businesses with less than 1,000 employees. So they are hitting the smaller companies. I'm sure that everybody's heard of the pipeline breach and the meat distribution breach and all of the disruption that it's causing to supply chains, and those are just the big ones that hit the news headlines. You don't really want to be on the national headlines for having a security breach, and there's thousands of security breaches that you don't hear about that aren't on the national headlines because they're smaller, maybe they go unreported. So that last little blurb on that slide is that Deloitte and Touche surveyed 225 manufacturing, basically that says that 50% of the respondents lack the confidence that they're protected from a cyber attack, and that 39% of them says that they've already had a breach within the last year. So from our perspective, one of the services that Black Bottle IT offers is that we answer a hotline. So when a company is breached, they'll call us, And like we get calls every day, every week from, small to, mid-sized business. And, and like we get all the horror stories of, hey, I've been attacked, I got like ransomware and I'm not going to be able to work tomorrow. Somebody did a, wire fraud and I transferred thousands of dollars to the wrong person. What do I do? Like the threat landscape for the small to mid-sized business is very real and it is out there. And so that is kind of the point of the NIST compliance, is that the government is now getting serious about holding, small to mid-sized manufacturers, like accountable for their own cybersecurity. And like, so that's the progression of where the NIST kind of compliance framework has kind of evolved from, its inception in 2017 to where it's going today. So, so that's kind of the background of like why we're here today a little bit. And like, so Mark Malloy is going to deliver the rest of the content. And so he's going to go into the NIST compliance. And it's really complicated in terms of acronyms, and there's a bunch of words and there's a bunch of things that we could fire hose you with. And like, so he's going to kind of keep it at a higher level. And he's going to go into the, and like he's going to go into the right level of depth for all of the important topics. So I guess with that, I'll just turn it over to Mark.
All right, John, thank you very much for the introduction. Again, my goal today is to give all of you a quick overview of NIST 800-171. I only have about 10 to 15 minutes, so I'll try not to get too far into the weeds, while also giving you a comprehensive overview of NIST 800-171 along with CMMC. I will dive a bit deeper on some important ideas, but I will not be able to get into depth on every point. Please write down any questions you may have for the end of the presentation. By the end of today's presentation, my goal is that you all have a general understanding of what NIST 800-171 is, what NIST 800-171 consists of, why it could be relevant to you, what CMMC is, and what steps should be taken to begin the NIST 800-171 compliance process. So first, let's begin with what is NIST 800-171? NIST 800-171 was created by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, in collaboration with the United States government. It is meant to be a set of best practices designed to protect controlled unclassified information, or CUI, and covered defense information, CDI. In other words, sensitive information, in response to increased cyber and physical attacks by domestic and foreign malicious actors looking to exploit this type of sensitive information. In other words, NIST 800-171 standardizes how federal agencies define and regulate CUI and CDI, data that is private and sensitive but not classified per federal law. Various versions of NIST 800-171 have been around since 2003. But NIST SP 800-171 became a federal requirement in 2017. NIST 800-171 consists of 110 controls divided between 14 categories. Next slide, please, John. So what is covered defense information, CDI, and controlled unclassified information, CUI? Understanding CDI and CUI can be confusing, but it is important because protecting CUI and CDI data between federal agencies and prime or subcontractors is the primary goal of NIST 800-171. The long-winded version of what CDI and CUI is as follows. CDI and CUI is unclassified information provided to the contractor by or on behalf of the Department of Defense or another federal agency in connection with the performance of the contract, or unclassified information which is collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by or on behalf of the contractor in support of the performance of the contract. In short, CDI and CUI, in essence, is sensitive data information that is technically not considered classified but still needs protected. If you are working with the Department of Defense or federal agencies and are in any way dealing with CDI and CUI, you will need to be NIST 800-171 compliant. On this slide, there are several examples of what could be considered CDI and CUI. For example, research and engineering data, engineering drawings, and associated lists, controlled technical information related to the military, or even privacy and proprietary business information. Next slide, please, John. So what does NIST 800-171 consist of? As I touched on previously, NIST 800-171 consists of 110 controls or line items spread out between 14 control groups. On this slide, you can see the 14 separate control groups. These control groups include incident response, awareness and training, and physical protection, among many others. These control groups and 110 controls between them are the boxes you will need to check if you want to be 100% compliant. Next slide, please, John. So, the big question, who needs to be NIST 800-171 compliant? Well, first, as I've already mentioned, any company dealing with CUI and CDI and looking to work with or in the Department of Defense's supply chain and with certain other federal agencies will need to be NIST 800-171 compliant, directly or indirectly. That means whether you are the primary contractor or even just a subcontractor to the primary contractor. Second, companies looking to have a strong cyber and physical security posture should at a minimum be NIST 800-171 compliant. As my colleague spoke of earlier, cyber attacks and data breaches are exponentially growing and causing millions in losses. No matter the size of your company, for the sake of self-preservation, you should implement the standard of compliance and security. Third and finally, any company looking to get ahead of the CMMC compliance should be 100% NIST 800-171 compliant. 100% NIST 800-171 compliance will make you CMMC Level 3 prepared. CMMC stands for the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, and it's going to replace NIST 800-171 in the near future. CMMC Level 3 will consist of all 110 NIST 800-171 controls, plus an additional 20, as of now, unique to the CMMC alone. So if you're looking to get ahead of CMMC compliance, that will be released by 2025 at the latest. The best first steps you can take to get ahead of your competition in this compliance obstacle will be to begin working towards 100% NIST compliance. The goal of CMMC will be to protect CUI, CDI, while also working to normalize and standardize cybersecurity preparedness for contractors looking to work with the Department of Defense and the federal government. I will elaborate shortly on the differences between NIST 800-171 and CMMC. Next slide, please, John. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the progression of NIST 800-171 from where it began in 2017, where it is today, and where it's going to progress to in the future. So I'm going to move left to right on this diagram I have here. At first, beginning in 2017, companies working with the Department of Defense and other federal agencies involving CUI and CDI had to be NIST compliant. From 2017 to November 2020, in order to be NIST compliant, a company had to self-attest that it was either A, 100% compliant, or B, in the process of working towards compliance. This would be shown through the creation of a POAM, which is a plan of actions and milestone document. This document would lay out a roadmap of how a company planned on becoming compliant by a certain date. However, what this led to was many companies not honestly working towards actually achieving 100% compliance. Rather, they would be in a continual state of working towards compliance. So while in theory they were compliant by being in the phase of working towards compliance, many companies were not genuinely working towards becoming 100% NIST compliant. This meant many companies working with federal agencies and the Department of Defense in possession of sensitive information were vulnerable to serious security breaches. Today, as a result, the federal government decided it needed to implement a more demanding criteria and a more demanding standard of compliance. This led to the creation of the CMMC certification that was meant to be rolled out in 2020 and was meant to replace NIST 800-171. However, due to COVID-19 and the logistical nightmare of creating and implementing CMMC during a pandemic, the new compliance standard, CMMC was postponed, and instead, the federal government decided to create an interim rule for NIST 800-171. This interim rule is to stand until the details of CMMC are solidified and put into place. Again, CMMC is projected to be released by 2025. So, today we are operating under the NIST 800-171 interim rule, which came into effect in late November 2020. Now, today, companies looking to hold and maintain contracts with the Department of Defense and other federal agencies will need to not just show they are working towards compliance. With the interim rule in place, companies now need to complete a gap analysis, create a system security plan or an SSP document, which is now mandatory for compliance, along with a POAM, which is a document that is a plan of actions and milestones. Furthermore, they now need to generate a supplier performance risk assessment score, or an SPRS score. An SPRS score ranges from a -203 to a positive 110. Remember, there's 110 controls. 110 being a perfect score. Now, some of these controls are weighted, which is why you can have a score as low as -203, but a perfect score is a 110. So this score needs to be uploaded now to a PIEE government website. This means today, in order to be NIST 800-171 compliant, you will need to undergo a gap analysis in order to understand where your company is compliant or not. Then you'll need to document where your company is compliant with evidence in a system security plan, along with a POAM. The POAM being a document that gives a roadmap of how you will fix and on what timeline your deficiencies. And finally, your company will need to generate an SPRS score and upload that score to the PIEE website. In theory, this must be done if your company deals with CUI and CDI in regards to contracts it currently has or plans to have with federal agencies and the DoD in the future. In order to be compliant, you do not need to have a perfect score just yet, but you will need to have the proper documentation and SPRS score generated and uploaded. You will also need to include a date by which your company plans on being 100% compliant. While the government has been slow to enforce some of these guidelines, in theory, assessors could ask for a company's documentation in order to justify the score it uploaded. Companies that upload a false score or have a cyber or physical security incident that results in a breach could be held liable for damages and potentially face legal and reputational consequences. Finally, if you look in the right column, the future holds the CMMC certification, which I've already touched on. CMMC will replace NIST 800-171 as a new compliance standard by 2025. Compliance will be mandatory to compete and win contracts in the DoD supply chain. CMMC will consist of 5 levels. Most companies will only need a level 3, which is similar to the current NIST 800-171 compliance standard. Audits will be performed to validate compliance, and accredited third parties will be required to attest to a company's compliance. The primary difference between NIST 800-171 and CMMC is CMMC will be demanded. There will be audits, and third parties will need to certify you are CMMC compliant before you receive contracts. On the bright side though, if you are 100% NIST compliant, you will be almost 100% CMMC level 3 compliant. For the time being, there are only an additional 20 controls in order to achieve level 3 CMMC compliance if you have already achieved 100% NIST compliant with the 110 guidelines in the NIST 800-171 compliance. For CMMC, you will need to meet all 110 NIST controls, plus an additional 20 controls specific to CMMC level 3, and you'll have to have the same documentation as you do for NIST, an SSP and a POAM. Next slide, please, John.
I just want to comment on this slide real quick, Mark, and that I wanted to say that this is an important slide to show like the timeline of progression, but then also current events with all of the national like breaches, like specifically the one that hit like the pipeline about a month ago, kind of has like escalated like the timeline to getting that CMMC like in place by like President Biden signed an executive order a few days after that pipeline, and it was 35 pages, and it basically mandated that every single government like agency that is that has data that escalates the timelines about when that data has to be secured according to some other standard. So I think that we're going to see that same kind of escalation in the timeline with the CMMC. So if anything, it's going to be sooner than 2025 by all of the recent like events that are happening. So
Right, and if you're concerned with being CMMC compliant, the best first step you could take is become 100% NIST 800-171 compliant, because as I mentioned, to be level 3 CMMC compliant, you have to have all 110 NIST controls plus an additional 20. So the best way you can prepare is to become NIST compliant beforehand.
Yep.
Because you don't want to be caught behind the 8 ball once CMMC arrives, right? So slide 10, John. So now you should have a basic understanding of what NIST and CMMC are. I know I threw a lot of information at you. So now you're probably asking, well, what are the best ways to start becoming compliant today? So here are 5 basic steps you can move through in order to achieve NIST 800-171 compliance today. First, you need to identify your resources. Do you have an internal or current IT team capable of tackling NIST 800-171 compliance and CMMC compliance? Or do you need to find a managed service provider or a new third party that specializes in NIST 800-171? Does your IT team, MSP, or third party understand NIST guidelines, how to remediate for each of the 110 controls, etc.? Second, once you've established your resources, you need to perform a gap analysis. Your gap analysis is basically going to be you and your resources going through your company and all 110 controls. Where are you compliant? Where are you not compliant? And then gathering evidence to prove you are compliant where you say you are. So once you've done your gap analysis, now it comes to creating your documentation. The system security plan, the SSP, is essential for NIST compliance. In order to be compliant now with the interim rule for NIST, you need an SSP, because that's what an assessor or the government is going to ask for if there is a breach, an incident, or they want to double check and see if your score is legitimate. They're going to say, show me your SSP documentation. Your SSP documentation documents where you are compliant, where you're not compliant, and it provides evidence of how you are meeting those controls in regards to compliance. So say if, for example, you say you do quarterly vulnerability scans, well, you're going to have to show maybe a screenshot of a quarterly vulnerability scan report, and that's going to be attached to your SSP. You're also going to have to create your POAM, which is a plans of actions and milestones. The purpose of this document is it basically lays out a roadmap for how your company is going to fill any controls that you are deficient in or are not meeting at the moment. So this plan will say who, what, where, when, and how you will become compliant. And now with the interim rule as well, you need a date by which complete compliance will be met, and that's typically put into your POAM. Once you have your gap analysis and you've created your documentation, you now need to generate and upload your compliance score. Your compliance score is your SPRS score, and that is uploaded into the PIEE government website. Your SPRS score basically is a grade on how compliant your company is with NIST. So a company that is 100% compliant with NIST 800-171 will have a score of a 110. A company that is not compliant at all with NIST will have a score of -203 potentially, and then anywhere in between. Finally, you need to think about remediation. When it comes to remediation for NIST 800-171, remember, you do not necessarily need to remediate everything at once. You can progressively remediate your deficiencies over a period of time as you outline in your POAM until the CMMC is released. But remember, when CMMC is released, you will need to be able to show you are 100% compliant with the level of CMMC needed for your company. So it will be up to you, the decision makers in your company, to decide how much gap filling or remediation they want to complete initially or over time, as is documented in your company's POAM and SSP. Next slide, please, John. So again, it may seem overwhelming. You have 110 controls you need to meet. Fortunately, a lot of the solutions and a lot of the ways you can remediate actually check multiple boxes with those 110 scores. Now, here on this slide, we have the top 6 weaknesses we've observed with manufacturers we work with. So in solving and remediating some of these weaknesses, you should be well on your way to, becoming NIST compliant. So this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. There's only a short list of some common weaknesses and areas that we see that need remediation. By having these tools in place for the 6 areas of weakness, you will be on your way to NIST compliance. So the first place, and this is a big one, is lack of policies and procedures. Many of these controls, the only way you can one of the main ways you can become compliant in those controls is by having a policy procedure in place. For example, with physical security, You need a physical, you're going to need a policy and procedure to show that, someone is actually at the front door, you're locking your doors. Not anybody can just willy-nilly walk into your business and potentially compromise sensitive information. The second area of weakness is a lack of an incident response plan. What happens if you're breached? Who, what, where, and when is key to addressing the situation, and a timely response is essential in mitigating risk. So many companies don't have an incident response plan in place in case, for example, they are compromised with ransomware. Third, a lot of companies lack vulnerability scans. Vulnerability scans are a necessary part of NIST, and they're suggested to be periodic. We personally suggest quarterly vulnerability scans, and basically this scans your system for any potential known vulnerabilities, either externally or internally, depending on what you want to do. We suggest doing both external and internal vulnerability scans. Fourth, a lack of security monitoring tools is a big one we see as well. In the event your network is breached, having intrusion detection and a live team to be able to respond to alerts and stop a potential threat is huge. A lot of companies lack a data backup strategy. It is the best practice to have an offsite backup solution in case something is compromised, or say, for example, Lord forbid, your building burns down and you lose all your information, you need to be able to back that information up, right? Finally, a lack of security awareness training. One whole control group of the NIST requirement is security awareness training. Generally speaking, the most dangerous attack vector and the way a lot of companies are compromised is through human error. So the one way you can help mitigate this risk is through regular employee training. And a lot of companies don't do this, so that is an important area also to focus on. So again, if you begin by trying to fix these 6 areas of weaknesses, you should be well on your way to becoming NIST compliant. John, do you have anything to add, or you can move on to the next slide?
Nope, good.
So for the most part, I'm running short on time here. I hope I gave you all a good general idea of what NIST 800-171 and CMMC consist of and why it's relevant, along with your next best steps forward. We're now going to have a few minutes to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, and so I'll just before the webinar, we had a couple questions come in, the pre-registration questions. So I'll just do these real quick. I know we have a minute. So the first one is, how long does it take my organization to, complete the compliance? Well, that really depends upon, the security posture of your company and what tools that you have, and basically the gaps that you have. So, once the gap analysis is completed, we'll then, a roadmap will then be, constructed to identify the timelines of, closing all that gap. So it could take anywhere from 30 days if you're really good to maybe 12 months if you're starting almost from scratch, right? So, I mean, it really depends on the company, and it really depends on the controls and the security posture that's in place. The second question is there a competitive advantage to becoming NIST 800-171 compliant? So, sometimes we talk to manufacturers and they say, hey, why should I care about NIST? Because the guy down the street that sells the same thing I do, or makes the same thing I make, they don't have it, so why should I? Well, that was true probably in the past, in terms of there wasn't really anybody that was kind of looking at the compliance standard, but technically, everybody has to if they have a DoD contract or they're in the supply chain. So I would say that, going forward, it will become a competitive advantage because, you will be eligible for contracts where, your competitor will not be even eligible to bid on them because they won't be, compliant. And so then as time goes on, the government is going to get serious about sending in people to audit to assess that you're compliant. So I would say that the competitive advantage is that you'll be eligible to bid on those contracts, whereas maybe your competitor won't be. So
also, just to touch on, I think you might have mentioned, again, the main competitive advantage here is NIST 800-171 is going to be replaced with CMMC, and CMMC, in order just to get a contract, you will have to be approved and have a badge from a third-party auditor. It will say you are compliant before you can even bid on those contracts. At least in theory, that's what they're telling us so far. Again, it's still fluid and there's a lot in motion. So if you want to get ahead of the curve, you want to be able to hit the ground running when CMMC is released. And the best way you can do that is be NIST 171 compliant today. If your competitors aren't, then they're going to be way behind the curve. It's going to maybe take them 6 to 12 months to be able to start bidding on contracts. If you're ready, you'll be able to bid immediately on those contracts. So that is another competitive advantage.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mark. You know, and like then the last question on the pre-registration question is, you know, how do I get started? Well, as Mark kind of touched on in a couple of slides ago, you know, the first like step to get started toward compliance is like identify like the resources that you're going to need in order to, you know, fill the gaps that you're ultimately going to find. So that would be the first step, is to find a resource, and you know, like, and like, so then the, you know, and like, so then the next step would be to do that gap analysis to really find out like where you stand, you know, in like relation to the compliance standard. So that would be the, you know, that would be how to get started. I don't know if we've had any questions come in. I'm going to flip over to the chat real quick here. Oops, I don't think we've had any questions.
No.
Yeah,
Oh,
I did have one come just to me. Somebody was asking about whether if they were a subcontractor, does this still apply to them?
Yep. So technically speaking, that's why I said directly or indirectly. Even if you are not the primary contractor, even if you're a sub to the primary contractor, if you are at all touching, handling, or dealing with CDI or CUI, you also need to be NIST compliant. So for example, even us as a company performing these compliances, since we potentially come into contact with people's CDI and CUI, we have to be NIST compliant as well. So I think as a best practice in general, moving forward, if you want to work with the Department of Defense especially and have contracts, and even just with the federal government in general, with everything that's taking place right now, they're only going to crack down harder and harder and want to implement more regulations. So I think it's a best practice in general to start working towards this compliance, because I wouldn't be surprised if a few years down the road, you won't be able to have any federal contracts or Department of Defense contracts if you don't have or meet some level of compliance.
Right. Okay. And I did have someone ask, Claudia, thank you. Excellent presentation. And if we're sharing the recording and the slides, and yes, we will be sending everything out to those who participated tomorrow afternoon. So I know you gentlemen had something about the gap analysis.
Yeah, so yeah, so I'm just going to flip through these other slides. So this is
Sure.
just like an appendix basically to the presentation that gives a lot of the acronyms that Mark was sharing. You know, we didn't want to, you know, fire hose you with all these acronyms during the presentation. So this will be part of the presentation that comes afterwards. So, you know, and like then the next slide is some helpful, you know, like links that if you wanted to, you know, like read up on the current, you know, like NIST standard, you know, the like interim rule that's in effect today, and like then what's coming soon with the, you know, CMMC. You know, those are some really good links to, you know, to follow, to read. You know, there's some new information on that CMMC page, like all the time. They have a, you know, they have a monthly town hall that they record that kind of gives you the lay of the land about where they are in, you know, as a, you know, as, you know, like in relation to getting the standard approved, you know, and like when you get in there, you'll see that, you know, like they're creating quite a process in there to, you know, like accredit people to go and like assess, and then there's educational requirements for you to be an accredited, you know, like assessor, and so then there's different levels of you know, compliance, and so they're spending a lot of time getting the standard and getting the process down. So at some point, you know, when it does become the law of the land, you know, they're going to be ready. And so then finally, you know, like we do gap analysis to you know, for NIST compliance. You know, like you know, like I mean, like Mark is just, you know, finishing up one now, you know, for like a client. So you know, so if you did want us to help you with gap analysis, I mean, we do the NIST gap analysis, and if you follow that link, and then we'll ask you some simple, you know, like questions about your environment, and so then we can kind of, you know, that'll be the getting started to, you know, like finding out your gaps and, you know, creating, you know, a like roadmap to you know, compliance. So so that's our little like plug about Black Bottle. And if you want us to help, you know, we're here to help. But you know, the mission really for us today was just to educate and to kind of like make sure that everybody on you know, like in attendance knows like the compliance is here and it's only going to get harder. And so if you want to continue to do business with the DoD, well, then these are things that you need to be, like aware of. So, and then I'll just wrap up by, thanking, Carrie for, like allowing us the opportunity to like present today. And I hope everybody in attendance found the information, like useful. So, thanks for your time. I know we ran over by about 7 minutes. So
It's all good. It's important information. So thank you, everybody, for attending. And again, like I said, I'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording if you needed to share it, or if you want to contact Black Bottle directly for anything. Again, you know who SOAN and the SVA are, and we thank you for your participation. So have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everyone.
thanks, everyone.